It feels like every time Ziz runs it, the Gauntlet improves in some way. And this time, the main way that the Gauntlet is improving is by allowing players to ease into the difficulty a little bit better. Before now, Gauntlet was absolutely brutal. You were thrown off the deep end right from mudflats when your build wasn't really very functional. But now, there's going to be a variation in the mods, so early on, you won't be so screwed over. This doesn't mean that early on the Gauntlet's going to be easy. Anything but, actually. Remember, the Gauntlet might have gotten a little easier in mudflats, but we also now have Arch Nemesis mods. And Arch Nemesis plus Gauntlet means that magic packs are going to be absolutely terrifying. So if you're someone who's looking to jump into the Gauntlet, and you're not sure what build to play, I'll get into that a little bit later. For now, I want to share a couple of tips about how to treat monsters early on. The first of which is, don't necessarily just run away from everything. There's a very good chance that if you're trying to run away from something, you could run into a different dangerous situation, miss position, or die. Your best weapon here is actually to be able to face the monsters head on, and you do this by over-leveling. So if in a given zone, you'd normally expect to be level 10, maybe be level 14 or 15. Now, obviously, this is about comfort. It is going to get very tedious if you're 5 or 6 levels over every zone. If you're feeling comfortable with both your damage and your defenses, by all means, be a lower level. After all, many of the players pushing the fastest are going to be a lot lower level than 4 or 5 over the zone. But never be afraid to stop and farm. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. Be sure to farm and prepare before you get to Kitava. The last thing that you want is to go into Act 6 especially, and have all of your res nuked by about 30%. That's just not going to be a good time. Instead, what you want to do is prepare early, have 30% over your resist cap, so after the Kitava fight, you'll be down to the normal amount of resistances. And the same goes, of course, for Act 10 when you're preparing for maps. You want to have more res so that you don't actually lose any. Now, a couple other changes that you should be aware of. Chaos Weaver is a thing. This means that being immune to poison or dealing with chaos damage over time isn't really good enough anymore. Enemies will also have significant chaos hits, which are in many cases scaled by Gauntlet mods. So be sure to pick up Chaos Res early, and when in doubt, an Amethyst Flask is your best friend. I actually debated if I should be making this video at all, since if you want to know what good builds existed for the Gauntlet, it's not that hard to find out. After all, there weren't any major changes from 3.17 to 3.18, which means if you want to know what the best Gauntlet builds are, you can go look that up on Pewee Ninja. And so I'm going to talk a little bit less about the Gauntlet builds people are playing, and a little bit more about the itemization and items that people are using in order to facilitate the build. I mean, if we come over to Pewee Ninja here, do you really need me to tell you that Explosive Arrow, Armageddon Brand, Poison Seismic Trapper, Spectral Helix, Cremation, Poisonous Concoction, Absolution, Wintertide Brand, RF, do you really need me to tell you that these are the things a lot of people are going to be playing? Probably not at this point. So, to start with, Kobe Black Mamba's Day 1 build for Detonate Dead in the previous Gauntlet. So, I'm just going to go over his gear quickly and some of his gems and give a few quick opinions. First off, the weapon. It's got fire damage and nothing else really going on here. Remember, this is Day 1 in the Gauntlet, so you don't really have any weapon options. But it's still pretty good for a Day 1 weapon, as it gives around 135% increased fire damage, which will apply to your Detonate Dead and any ignites that it inflicts. Looking around, what else do we have on gear? I'm noticing a minimum endurance charge on a ring with endurance charge on kill. This is a pretty nice way to get some extra resist and fizz reduction into your build. You'll want to be capped anyway, but if enemies inflict exposure, having a little bit extra doesn't hurt. I'm also noticing that on his gloves and his chest piece he's got spell suppression, maybe none on the helmet or boots yet, so I don't know that he's necessarily quite capped, but having spell suppression is very good, as that's a defensive layer you'll want to work into the build eventually. I also notice several points where he has Chaos Res. Remember what I said, Chaos Weaver is very dangerous, so getting Chaos Res early on is important. I'm sure most of the rest of the gear looks like floor garbage, but a couple of things stand out. One of which is, this helmet was a veiled item. I kind of doubt that he got a Veiled Chaos and rolled it. Maybe I could go back and check a VOD, maybe there's a YouTube video. But I'm going to pretend that it just dropped on the floor. And this is a resource that's easily overlooked normally in Path of Exile trade. But in something like the Gauntlet, every veiled item is a potential gold mine. Getting something like Lightning Chaos Res as a hybrid suffix is going to add a lot of value, and it's most likely the reason that this helmet is what he's wearing, as opposed to any other random helmet off the floor. Something else that's very important, which I see far too many players end up overlooking, is flask suffixes. We've got reduced mana cost of skills on an enduring flask. This means mana is basically not a problem. We've got a Jade Flask with immunity to freeze and chill. We've got immunity to corrupting blood and bleed on our life flask. Cast speed during flask effect, good little boost to smoothness and a little overall damage. And of course, the Granite Flask with increased evasion rating. It's entirely possible that armor is ideal here, but we're talking day one, and just having relevant suffixes on every single flask is a huge boost to the build. If you've ever wondered why your build feels really bad in early maps as compared to someone else, there's a very good chance it's that you weren't paying attention to your flask suffixes. Looking overall, we've got Hypothermia, which makes sense. We're a Necromancer, we're always chilling. Ignite Prolif, Combustion, Val-DD, Cruelty, Flame Dash with some Desecrate. Molten Shell's always very good. Early Determination and Defiance Banner to get nice and tanky. Grace to help while mapping. And a good old Shield Charge faster attacks. This setup is exactly what I'd expect from Val-DD. It stays alive and does it pretty damn well. Next up, we've got Terence, who is playing an Explosive Arrow champion. I honestly don't advise Explosive Arrow champion if you're playing in softcore trade. Sure, it's fine to start, but there's a lot of other things that you could do, which will be a lot smoother and don't have the innate clunkiness of Explosive Arrow Ignite. They also don't have the innate clunkiness of playing a build on a champion that it kind of sort of isn't in the tree position for. That's an argument for another day, though. For now, I want to point out something that's very important. Quillrain is a low-level unique. It's very easy to farm for this if you get an early Sentinel, if you get a low-level Heist, or from so many other things, and it's basically your best-in-slot weapon. If you are planning to play Explosive Arrow Ignite in the Gauntlet, make sure to get yourself a Quillrain as soon as possible. You probably won't end up taking it off. In fact, if I look at, let's just say day 6, he's got a better bow finally, but Terence also puts in a lot of time and probably advances quite a bit faster than most people. If we go back to day 3, same Quillrain, and I'm not surprised at all because, again, very solid item. It'll get you all your fuses in the target, which is quite important. Now, looking around a little bit more, he's got a Tabula, not much to say there. It's good for socketing 6 things, and that's about it. We've got some accuracy, some attack speed. Very nice ring. This is also a veiled item. It's an Amethyst base. We've got Tier 1 life, Cold and Chaos Res. Again, paying close attention to Chaos Res is very important early on, and even more so now that Arch Nemesis is part of the game. Looking at the rest of the gear, there's no spell suppression yet. I feel like that's mostly because on a champion, you're not as pressured for spell suppression as you might be on another build. After all, you have Fortify to fall back on. And sure enough, we've got Fortitude here. This is what I mean when I say that overall, the tree is in a little bit of an awkward state if you're playing an Explosive Arrow champion. You want to be up here, and you also want to be down here, and that pathing is just really, really awkward. Now looking at the gems, he is life tapping almost everything. This is a way to not have to worry about mana costs. The only mana he's really paying is for something like Enduring Cry, which, sure, there's some level of mana cost there, but the expenditure is so small that he doesn't have to worry about it, and even if he happens to run out of mana, it's most likely not going to be life or death, since he also has 2 life flasks to fall back on. For auras, again, we've got Determination, we've got Defiance Banner, we've got Grace. You're going to be seeing that a lot. And in this case, we also have Summon Skitterbot, which is a great way to add early damage to pretty much any build. If you're not already shocking enemies, then there you go. And if you're not already chilling enemies, this is a great way to enable one more damage link. I wouldn't be surprised if on single target, he's swapping the LMP out for Hypothermia support. That will always be on due to the Skitterbots, and again, it's a great way to add a bit of extra damage. Next up, we've got Paak, also known as Paak HC, who is playing a Cold DoT character on, it looks like an Elementalist right now. I'm not sure if this was just an early league plan, or if he stayed Elementalist the whole time. Let's jump ahead to say day 5 and see. Nope, he has stayed Elementalist the whole time. In terms of gear, it also looks like he was keeping Winterheart, but I'll get into that in just a bit. This looks to be a pretty standard Cold DoT setup for a life-based character. You've got Vortex for most of your damage, and then you're using something like Paak Cold Snap to boost the damage even further. In this case, Paak Cold Snap is the Bone Chiller, whereas Vortex is the quote-unquote main damage. You can also alternatively use Wintertide Brand, but that's a little bit of a different playstyle. And again, just browsing through the items, there's a few things that stand out to me. The first of which is a little bit of spell suppression. It's kind of hard to fully cap your suppress on day 1 in solo self-found hardcore, but getting someone with shield is still helpful. After all, you're not going to be pushing content this early to the point where something's likely to be a straight-up one-shot. You're not fighting bosses yet. If 1 in 5 hits gets suppressed, that's a good way to lower your damage intake. I also noticed this helmet has the Delve mod for 10% of fizz damage from hits taken as fire. This could alternatively be the Corrals mod. I don't know if it's a prefix or a suffix just from looking at Pewee Ninja. Either way, both mods are good to have, and either one will serve you very well. It's the little touches like this, as opposed to just using generic rares off the floor, that often show the difference between the most expert Gauntlet players, the people who are getting into maps on day 1, and everyone else. And it really goes to show how much of a knowledge-based game Path of Exile is, to know that you can either target Corral for fizz taken as fire, or you can go delving. To know that you can do something like have a Cold and Chaos ring, which yet again we've seen another person using. If you happen to get one of these, it's not an uncommon suffix, and they're pretty good. Especially since Chaos Res is more important than it ever was. But in terms of the rest of Paak's gear here, honestly, nothing too remarkable. Looking at flasks, I bet we're again going to find good suffixes. Yep, every single suffix here is relevant. There's maybe a little bit of overlap on the Mana Flask plus the Quicksilver. Still, I'd rather have freeze redundancy than die to freeze. One last thing to comment on before I look at gems. This is a Ghost Dance setup. The value of Ghost Dance is you get an additional layer of recovery when you're struck. So if you're getting hit all the time, it's not that great. If you're getting hit occasionally, it is excellent. And I'm going to guess that Paak plays well enough that he's only getting hit occasionally, especially since he's playing a Cold DoT build where he can chill enemies, thus slowing them. The Winterheart says he can't be chilled, and he regenerates 10% of life per second while frozen. So even if he did get frozen with his flask down for whatever reason, there's a very good chance you're going to survive if you're wearing a Winterheart, at least long enough to use your flask and get out of there. Now, looking at gems, there's, well, exactly the usual candidates that you'd see. Determination, Defiance Banner, Grace. Though he takes it one step further with a Blasphemy support for Enfeeble. Enfeeble is an aura that normal or magic enemies deal 29% less damage and rare or unique deal 14% less. They also have reduced accuracy, which makes your evasion much more effective. By turning this into an aura, you're essentially getting another defensive layer, a la Champion's Fortify. Though it's not quite Fortify levels of powerful because even with Curse Effect, it's not going to do very much to unique enemies. Now, there's 2 more builds I'm going to look at and kind of go over, but if you found this helpful so far, or if this has given you a better idea of what sort of gear to look out for when you're playing in the Gauntlet, please do leave a like, that really helps me out. If this video does well, I may actually cover the Gauntlet a bit more this time. So if that interests you, let me know down in the comments what sort of Gauntlet coverage you'd like to see, and be sure to subscribe, then ring the bell to be notified whenever I upload. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for their continued support, but more about that at the end. For now, let's get back to looking at Gauntlet builds, starting with a Poison Seismic Trap Saboteur. Or at the very least, I'm going to guess Poison. I haven't actually looked at these builds ahead of time. So we've got a dagger with chance to poison on hit, increased damage with poison, and trap damage. I'm gonna say it's a safe bet that we're a poison build here. Seismic Trap in the helmet, Trap in mine, Advanced Trap life tap, duration of ailments you inflict, good old veiled mods coming through, definitely a poison build. Some spell suppression on the chest, very nice. Some spell suppression I would expect on the shield too. Yep, on the shield. This is a build where getting your spell suppressed cap as soon as possible is going to be very, very, very important in the Gauntlet. So don't slack on it. Pick up Magebane if you need, pick up any sort of suppressed nodes that you need, and get it on a couple pieces, because it's better to be suppressed than to be sorry. We've also got a Granite Flask. This build has a relatively easy time getting evasion rating and a relatively difficult time getting armor rating. So you'll want to prioritize armor wherever you can get it. This means things like a hybrid armor evasion base, or by making sure you have a Granite Flask. And in terms of flasks, I would say these aren't quite as good as some of the others I've seen. I'm sure this one got upgraded fairly quickly. Then we've got evasion during flask effect. That's pretty good. Reduced shock. Maybe not as helpful would be for non-saboteur, but saboteur's already immune, so this is kind of a dead suffix. Corrupted blood, gotta have that. And chill and freeze, gotta have that, at least in some form. So still, pretty good flasks overall. A lot of the time when you see this build in softcore trade, you'll see a lot of uniques. You may see a unique helmet, unique boots, potentially a unique belt, unique weapons, and you'll be dual wielding. In the Gauntlet, there's going to be none of that. Rare's all the way, and dual wielding is for dead people. You don't want to be a dead person, so you're going to hold a shield. Coming down to the skills, let's see what we've got. Exsanguinate, Cluster Trap, Trap, Chain. Makes sense. This way you get to poison with some Exsanguinate traps. Seismic Trap also makes sense. The life tap is to never run out of mana while throwing your Seismic Traps, which means the Mana Flask probably isn't all that important, as it's only going to be used for skills like the Despair, the Shield Charge, etc. And of course, there's Summon Skitterbot, good old generic damage increase. Determination, Defiance Banner, and Val Molten Shell. I would expect that almost every single build that we see has Determination, Defiance Banner, and Val Molten Shell. That definitely has nothing to do with the fact that Val Molten Shell is overpowered. And speaking of, the last build of the look into the Gauntlet is Goratha's Spark character, with the excellent pun for a name. This is on an Inquisitor. Inquisitor is pretty much the go-to ascendancy for feel-good self-cast. I suppose you could do it on Elementalist, but it's just not going to be the same. Looking at the gear a little bit, we've got what's honestly an incredibly good Cold DoT wand, more so than a Spark wand, but lightning dispels spell damage cast speed still works pretty well. On the helmet, we don't have a Veiled mod this time, but we do have the Crafted Corels mod, which is much the same thing. Chest piece, good old Life is Extra Max CS, and honestly not too much else except for very solid armor and energy shield. It wouldn't surprise me if we look a couple days ahead, maybe day 2, maybe day 3. Oh, day 2, it already got upgraded to something with Spell Suppress. Because if you really want to be immortal on an Inquisitor, all you really have to do is work in some good Suppress. But getting Suppress on gear on an Inquisitor on day 1, alright, on the shield, that makes sense. Even life gain on block, that is an amazing mod to have with Spell Suppress, and you can always fix the prefixes later. The gloves aren't really too much of anything, they're probably there for stat fixing more than anything else, and likely got upgraded fairly quickly. Checking day 2, nope, they survived. Day 3, nope, they survived. I guess the gloves filled the annoyingly effective role of stat fixing, and so they didn't get upgraded for quite some time. But looking back to day 1, minimum endurance charges, endurance charge on kill, also really great to have. Definitely keep an eye out for Veiled mods. A pretty simple ring, some more Chaos res, little bit of life in ES, and a belt with fire and chaos. Then finally some Wanderlust, which means Goratha does not have to worry about being frozen. These are definitely not a permanent item. As you could see from the later gear progression, they get replaced by day 2, with a pair of two-tone boots that also have Spell Suppress. But for day 1, yeah, they're pretty amazing. And you can usually farm them really easily in low-level zones. Just gonna do a quick flask check. Yep, evasion rating, corrupting blood, movement speed, reduced effective curses, and movement speed. So one suffix that's maybe not super impactful, but otherwise a really good mix of flasks here. And I especially like the quartz to prevent yourself from getting body blocked and ending up dead. Looking down at gems, we've got a 4-link with Spark, Pierce, Inspiration, Faster Casting, an Orb of Storms to boost single target, since overall a 4-link Spark probably not going to do all the damage yet. Decoy Totem is incredibly effective, but not always the easiest to play. You have to know that you're going to be in danger, and Tornado is somewhat similar. Keep in mind you won't be able to drop Tornado and Orb of Storms both at the same time. So if you don't really know what you're doing, probably don't copy the setup one for one. Finally, we've got the Determination Grace obligatory aura setup, Sniper's Mark because we're using Spark, and because we're non-crit, Defiance Banner, Molten Shell, all the good stuff that you're expecting. This is something that's a little bit different compared to your regular Gauntlet fare. The first two builds and the Seismic Trapper are more of what I'd expect, But it goes to show that if you know what you're doing, you don't have to have the build that everyone else is playing. You just have to have a plan and know how to execute it. Something which Goratha was fully able to do. The Gauntlet is some of the hardest content available in Path of Exile. At the very least, the hardest content until we get actual hard mode. Though at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if PoE 4 was out before hard mode. In the past, I've made build suggestions, and then after the Gauntlet's over, went back and analyzed things to see what was the most successful. This time, I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to provide people with a starting point, and talk about why I see items on certain builds, and why people might be using something. To give reminders to utilize all your resources because you're an SSF. You will have to heist. You'll want to do any Immortal Syndicate encounter you can, and pay really close attention to those veiled items. You'll want to delve and look for any sort of node that can give you items that are relevant to your build. There's actually a lot of power in Path of Exile that largely gets overlooked due to the fact that it's not common or popular in softcore trade. The Gauntlet's one of a few places that's actually really good at bringing light to these things, be it absolutely broken builds like Poison Bladefall Blade Blast that went on to define a meta for almost a year, or really cool items, like the fact that you can get underground and veiled stuff, which is useful for more things than just recombination. So hopefully, if you're planning to do some Gauntlet practice, you'll be able to keep some of these things in mind as you do, and hopefully it serves you well by the time you get to maps. Remember, patience is your best friend. Go slow, don't be afraid to overlevel, and you might surprise yourself at how far you'll get. To everyone competing in the Gauntlet, I wish you the best of luck, and who knows, I might be talking about this topic sometime soon. But if you have played in the Gauntlet before, what tips would you give to someone looking to play in the 3.18 Sentinel Gauntlet? Let me know, and let everyone else know, down in the comments below. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon, or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.